morning and welcome to Life at Noon. My name is Rachel Hugenberg. I'm one of the librarians here at the Lone Star Sci-Fair Library, and I'm really excited today because we are discussing one of my favorite things, which is podcasts. A lot of us have gotten into podcasting over the last year or listening to podcasts if you haven't launched your own. But today I am very happy to have Melissa Ratliff, newscaster, podcaster now, and reporter with us to discuss her new upcoming podcast, which is called God's Favorites, and it is a history podcast. She is also a well-known figure on History TikTok. So Melissa, if you would, take it away, please.
I would love to. It's nice to meet everybody. I know we're going to have more people coming in, so thanks for joining. This is my first, I think. And the podcast is still in development. It's coming out September 1st. But let me tell you a little bit about what brought me to create a podcast. And I will share my screen. Hopefully this will do a little bit of everything I need. Now, hopefully this will make me able to share the slideshow and you should be able to see everything. So I'm not just I'm a history nerd. I always have been, but I'm also a content creator. I do digital content for television stations, and I have been in journalism for the better part of going on 8 years at this point. And you would think when I came home from work, I would just want to chill and not make more content, but it is actually my favorite thing to do. So let's talk about what led me to doing a podcast and my life thus far. So let me go ahead and I'll minimize this. If you have any questions at any time, I guess you can type them in the chat or raise your hand. And I'm assuming Rachel's going to let me know if I'm missing something. So let me go ahead and
I will, if there's questions as it comes up, I will get them asked.
Perfect. All right, let's meet me. I'm good at talking about myself because I did theater and speech growing up. I'm a 4-H baby. My mother worked in 4-H and she got me dragged me into speech and drama at a very, very young age. So that if you aren't hearing an Appalachian accent, that's probably why I got dragged to speech contests everywhere as a child. So obviously, if we can see from this photo on the side here, I have always been a big fan of history since I was a kid. It wasn't always the subject I liked the most in school, but in high school and in college, I had some amazing history teachers that got me really into it. So I grew up in rural Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky, and now I'm in Florida, which is a very strange bouncing around turn of events there. But I've always loved to read. I always did love history. I was specifically really into colonial history, obviously, as a kid. I think that's picture me at Colonial Williamsburg when I'm about 9. I would call myself a weird kid, that kid that likes to read, definitely undiagnosed ADHD. And I did a lot of speech drama growing up, and I wanted to grow up and travel the world and see outside of Appalachia, which thankfully I've been able to do. I lived in France for a while. I have a degree in French, and I love French history. It's now my number one thing, but there's also some other things that I've gotten into. And I think a side effect of that ADHD I had as a kid was definitely hyper focus. So I would get very obsessed with certain things. So what do? I am a digital content manager for a television station here in Florida. I worked in Kentucky prior to that in Lexington. And I'm also on air occasionally doing digital segments, and I create content on the daily, news stories. I write news stories, I do social media posts, and I like to connect with people and do a segment on air currently about what people are talking about online and why they're talking about it. So I decided to work for a news station. I left my station in Kentucky and came to Florida, and right in the middle of the pandemic. It was a crazy time to move, and I moved to Florida and I loved it, but also everything was shut down. So I was kind of isolated in my apartment. I wasn't even going to work. I was working remotely most days at that point, and I hadn't even met most of my coworkers. So I like time alone, but I'm definitely an extrovert. So that was a very, very hard time for me. I knew no one, and being stuck inside with my dog, and I'm a creative type, and I started going insane. I like to say that. So I discovered TikTok. The Gen Z employees I worked with kept talking about this app. Now, TikTok is mostly known for being amongst kids. It's dancing. Kids dance. Kids, do little skits and things on there. I thought I was way too old to be on TikTok. And I tried to do the dance thing like everybody else was doing, but then the comments kind of ranged from, what are you doing, to somebody come get their mom was my favorite. So I realized that I wasn't going to be able to fit into that mold. But then I discovered that TikTok is so much more. It is the fastest growing social media app in the world. And here's a little example. It's not just dancing teenagers. It is a space for people to share stories, comedy, discuss issues, and create truly original content. And if you're successful at it, the app will actually pay you to do it because they want to create this. They get money from advertising, and instead of it going to Facebook, like, Mark Zuckerberg, it's actually going to some of the top creators on the app. So here's a video of what TikTok looks like. Not just dancing though. So it looks like a lot of pretty people on there, right? But what you'll discover is there is food TikTok, there is drama TikTok, there's music TikTok. There are literally TikToks for fandoms, Star Trek, Star Wars, Shadow and Bone, people who love reading books. There's Book Talk, which is launching these unknown authors are getting to the top of the chart from self-publishing just because they talk about their books on TikTok. It is revolutionary in that regard. And so, to succeed on TikTok, you've got to pay attention to the trends. Trends meaning like you see memes online, you see people having conversations online and sharing things, right? They're talking about current events, and you have to pay attention to the sounds. There's music on there. There are people who take bits of movies and do little skits with the movies. So you got to pay attention to what people are doing. And here's the one thing you have to be: to thine own self be true. You will do 1000% better on this app. That's just me making up a number. But if you talk about the things you know and love, and for me, besides things like musical theater and journalism and things that I'm really interested in, that was history. So I began making what I call history talks. And there's a whole subset of history creators. Some of them are museums. The Smithsonian Channel is on there. And they talk about events that they are interested in. There's like World War I TikTok, World War II TikTok. There's people who focus on certain things. Obviously, mine's going to be French history a little more because I have a background in that. But it's just a lot of fun for me. So what do I love about history? Well, I grew up listening to my mother tell me stories about the Tudors. My mother, in Eastern Kentucky, obsessed with Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth. She loved all those stories. And I grew up listening to those. I have a French degree, and I lived in France for a while. I taught English to elementary school kids there, but that allowed me the opportunity to get to know these historic figures in a way that isn't taught necessarily in American schools. Now, I took AP European in high school, but I got to go to these places. Malmaison, that's the place where Napoleon and Josephine lived. Versailles, Aix-en-Provence, where we have all these artists. So like Picasso lived there for a while. Paul Cézanne was from there. And so I got to get immersed in these histories, and I was always talking about it. I don't shut up about it. That's just because it's something interesting. So here are some of the stories you might hear. Oops, that's a typo. Here on my channel. So here's the things Melissa loves and has covered on her channel. Napoleon is my absolute favorite historical character. I talk a lot about the French Revolution too, because the French Revolution is still changing the world today, I would argue. The Haitian Revolution is a big one. I've been to Haiti multiple times. And Gettysburg and other events such as that. So you can make informational TikToks with History Talk. Here's one of the informational ones I've done.
I want to tell you about two things that happened on this day in history, April 15th. It was Jackie Robinson's first time on the field as a Major League Baseball player. We hear this story a lot in elementary school about how a poor young man from the South broke racial barriers to become one of, if not the greatest baseball player of all time. As always, it's never that simple. But this is his story, so Jackie was a college dropout who joined the military. Crazy athletic, played everywhere except for the major leagues. When he finally did, our textbooks tell us that was a win, right? It was never easy for him. He was the constant recipient of racism from fans, teammates. He wasn't allowed to eat at some restaurants with them or even sleep at the same hotels. And yet he went back out there every single time. It shouldn't have had to have been that way, but he did it. He became a civil rights leader. And on April 15th, 1997, the number 42 is retired.
So you can do these little 60-second videos, or you can take funny noises, funny sounds that are available. There we go. Okay. Or you can lampoon history with pop culture, which is also my favorite thing. I'm assuming everybody on here is old enough to remember Mentos commercials, correct? Not late 80s, 90s Mentos commercials. This is another one. I did another short one about the invasion of Napoleon into Moscow when Alexander I, who is Catherine the Great's grandson and one of his ultimate rivals, in that time frame, Alexander I burns down Moscow just so Napoleon couldn't have it. What better way to tell this story on this app than a Mentos commercial? Let me say, I did actually have to go buy a pack of Mentos just to make that. I don't know anybody who actually eats Mentos, but here we are. Oh, why does it keep, okay. Oh, there we go. So how did that go for me? Pretty well. As you can see, I'm up over 250,000 followers, and followers was not my necessary goal in this mission. I wanted to create, that's what I do. And then suddenly some of these followers were asking me to start a history podcast. I'm a big fan of the medium of podcasting. It's long form storytelling. I have some favorites, and I'm going to give you some suggestions as we wrap up. And I have a lot of experience in journalism. And at my last station before I left, I was trying to start a podcast, and my news director there told me it was a waste of time. It's not. It's one of the biggest, ventures that you see more and more news stations getting out on this to tell local stories, especially if they have any sort of high profile cases in their area or investigative pieces. And it's changing the world. Some of my friends say it's just a throwback to radio, but I disagree because it's got social elements brought in there as well. So let's talk about what happens. So when you're starting a podcast, one of the things I think you have to, I know we're all pretty much independent people, you cannot be afraid of crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing, if you don't know, is the use of having your followers contribute money. You give them rewards either in terms of like merchandising, or you give them extra content that you can create separately if they want to donate financial money. And I started crowdsourcing, and I now have enough money from that crowdsource to buy the equipment that I so desperately need to start this, because you do have to have equipment and it does cost money to produce podcasts. But people who are supportive of you want to see you do well. And that is something you need to consider. You cannot be afraid of crowdsourcing. Personally, I started an LLC just so that I could use it as a for tax purposes. Some people just ask, hey, I want to make this, documentary, this podcast. Would you be willing to support this initial thing? And you can actually get people involved to help you out with this. So it's a lot. It's the way that a lot of people who are in creative fields get financial support to start something. Starting out filmmakers, documentary makers, authors, graphic novelists. So you'd be amazed how many people are willing to get behind an idea. Even largely popular podcasts, ones that are number 1, number 2 on the iTunes and Spotify charts, have either crowdsourced in their beginnings or are continuing to crowdsource. And many donate additional funds above production cost to charity. Timesuck Podcast is one of my favorites. He does a lot of history and true crime, and he has a Patreon that he keeps up, even though he's quite popular and has sponsorships. But anything over production cost and paying employees he works with is given to a charity that the fans choose monthly. They always pick, a separate charity every single month, and they're up to donating like $10,000 to $20,000 a month to charity. So best sites for crowdsourcing. I started with Kickstarter. Now, it is a website where you set a goal. You have a certain amount of time to raise the funds for that, and you can receive donations over the goal. I went $700 over my goal. My goal was $3,000 to get some equipment. I raised $3,700. Now the cons are they do take a small cut. It's not very much, a couple $100 off of that. And the fundraising is all or nothing. So if you do not make the minimum goal, you do not get the money, just because they don't want to have anybody, not being able to create the thing that they wanted to do. Because if they have a $10,000 movie they're making, they only raise $2,000 monies. They don't want them to turn around and try to make a $10,000 movie with $2,000 of money. There's also Patreon, which is used by most large podcasts. It's a monthly subscription site where donors pledge a monthly amount, usually $1, $2, $5. This is money that continues to come in after the Kickstarter was over with, right? And you can build relationship with those donors by offering rewards, i.e. extra content, interviews, that sort of thing. Cons, but there are fees, and the money can be delayed coming in just due to the amount of the site. It takes almost 2 to 3 weeks at a time, but it's good resources for it's good with you can get these smaller items you need for research. Like I use a lot of the Patreon money, one to pay for like some streaming memberships that I'm going to have to sign up with, or buy books, because books are not cheap, especially if you're doing a research on a very obscure person and these books are all out of print. You can pay upwards of, on my first podcast I had to pay $80 for one book just because it was out of print, but I needed. So that's a good way to have some resources for programming that you need. So actually starting the podcast. So I've been actually making friends, including the host of Time Suck Podcast, who's given me advice, and a couple other friends who do podcasting on the side. Distribution is the trickiest thing you're going to learn about here when you're creating your podcast. You also have to consider like things like music, graphics that you use for your cover art. You may need to pay someone to create that for you, or pay for a music site that's going to give you, non-copyrighted music. That's going to be a different. There's also distribution softwares that distribute the podcast to things like your Apple Podcast, where you may be listening to yours, or Spotify and SoundCloud. It's usually not that expensive, but it does help to have somebody shoot those out for you instead of having to go to each individual website and upload your podcast. And those are the things I have learned. And I think just starting out, I wish I had known that, because thankfully I have people to tell me. And so now I'm telling you, if this is something that you are actually interested in doing, consider those things first. And I have a good list of resources here. I'm sure this will be available after the fact. There are a couple of things like Lisbon, Acast, SoundCloud is free, but there's also a few things that are going to want to, charge you to upload your podcast. And if you can have that all in one centralized location, they're going to upload those podcasts for you. And it's one less thing to worry about that's going to make your life easier. And there are a lot of people out here trying to take advantage of people who are trying to create content with false promises, but these are tried and true. So if this is something you're actually interested in, you can investigate these on your own should you want to start it. But we can also talk a little bit about what my podcast is going to be about. But first, some recommendations. So if you like history like I do, here are some of my faves. Hardcore history. Everybody wants to be Dan Carlin in the history world, but you have to set aside 6 or 7 hours for his episodes, because he basically makes what I would like to call the mini-sodes, or mini series of podcasts. He doesn't drop them very often. He spends months or years researching these, and they come out in these 8-hour episodes, and it's intense. It is intense, but he is one of the best researchers, bar none, out there. Stuff you missed in history class. Oh, that's another good one. It's great. You're Wrong About is a pretty new one, and it's from, I think, someone who works at NPR, if I'm not mistaken, but they basically take these events in history that everyone thinks they know about. Columbine, Princess Diana's death, things of that nature. Even Marie Antoinette was featured on there, because there's a lot of complexities about Marie Antoinette's life that get left out in the let them eat cake narrative. By the way, she never said that. Just heads up, that's one of my favorite factors. And they sit there and they say, here's the preconceived notion you have on this subject, and here's why you need to unlearn everything you learned about it. The Age of Napoleon, obviously a personal one for personal reasons, because Napoleon's probably my favorite. And The Dollop. Now, this is a comedy podcast about American history, in which one comedian tells his best friend about a story from American history that he does not know, so he can react to it in real time. It's a comedy. I know not everybody likes comedy with their history, but I find it incredibly hilarious. So those are some recommendations. There's also a lot out there for true crime. Obviously, My Favorite Murder is the big one that everybody talks about. There's also The Trail Went Cold, which is a personal favorite of mine. And now the show Unsolved Mysteries has a podcast, as does Dateline. So you can also check out, if you like those true crime shows or Snapped or whatever, they have some amazing true crime podcasts out there as well. And then there's a podcast pretty much on every subject. There's news reviews, there's people who do politics. You can find anything. Old Hollywood, lots of good stuff. So let me plug mine first. I'm launching it on 9/1. Yes, September 1st is the launch of God's Favorites, a History podcast. So I always like to explain the God's Favorite thing, and it has a lot to do with the first subject. God's favorites, the title came from not thinking that necessarily God has favorites, but there are people in this world who seem to be incredibly lucky, including that will be the first subject I'm doing on my podcast, my latest obsession, and nobody talks about him that often. So I'm excited to tell you about him shortly. But also there are these people in history who think they are ordained by God, or all the kings in history talking about God's right to rule. Napoleon Bonaparte clearly thought he was one of God's favorites. So it's more tongue-in-cheek play of these people who think the world revolves around them. Not necessarily in every single case, because some people appear to be fated, and then you have the people who just think they're God's favorites. And obviously I had an artist friend. This is something I use some of my Patreon money to do, is pay an artist friend to make my face as Marie Antoinette getting my head cut off, because I think it's funny. My mother was a little horrified at it though. But if someone is creating something for your show, I encourage you to try to pay them as much as you can. And I find most people are understanding if you're just starting off, they'll take a pretty small fee for everything. So you can include things like that in Patreon money or any of your crowdsourcing money. I think it's very important to pay the people you work with. I'm paying a research assistant for a mini-sode, but I'll get more into that as we go forward. So let me tell you about why I'm so excited about this first subject. This is the series will be the feature of Charles Lightoller. I'm assuming most of you have seen the 1997 film Titanic, or the 1953 film, A Night to Remember. And the story of how I learned about Charles Lightoller was funny. I knew who he was because as a kid, I went through a massive Titanic phase. I know everyone did. I watched A Night to Remember when I was a kid. I had very fuzzy memories of it. And in the 1997 Kate and Leo Titanic blockbuster, you'll probably remember him as the guy who underloaded the lifeboats and then pulled a gun on everybody and tried to get them to calm down. Fun fact, that never happened. He did underload the lifeboats, but it was due to a communication error. But here's the thing, people miss the best stories because there are so many stories that came out of Titanic that you don't know. Now, he was the center of the 1953 film, but like I say, that's just one moment of this man's life. I heard his story on a podcast. He was briefly mentioned by Dan Cummins on Time Suck, where he just gave a little blurb of this man's life. And when I heard it, I had cold chills go through my body because I was like, how does nobody know this story? So let me tell you Charles Lightoller's story. He survived as a baby, his entire family, with the exception of his father, dropping dead of scarlet fever outbreak. He's raised by family. He decides he doesn't want to be a member of the Industrial Revolution. So he decides to go into sailing. This man's story just screams. It's where I started calling him God's favorite every time I talked about him, because his story is so incredible. And I'm so excited that he's the first series, because he gets overshadowed in the Titanic with Captain Smith going down with the ship. But this man was the second officer on the Titanic. He was a last minute replacement on the Titanic. And he gets pulled down with the ship as he's trying to cut loose a collapsible lifeboat for people. And he gets sucked down and thinks he's dying. He's pinned up against a grate. And then at the moment that the ship splits, hot water hits, or cold water hits a hot steam boiler. It causes an explosion and it shoots Lightoller back up to the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, right next to the overturned lifeboat he had been trying to cut loose. Now it's overturning, kind of starting to sink a bit, and you can't just flip it back over because it's waterlogged, and that would have sank the boat. So what he does is stand on top of this boat, pull people from the water, and then with I think 2 or 3 paddles, instructs them on how to shift their weight so that they can keep an overturned lifeboat afloat for 4 hours. As one person will die of hypothermia, they will sink down altogether. He saves the life of Charles Joffin, a baker, one of the wireless operators, and Colonel Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger who was very notorious. They kept that boat, which was actively sinking, up for 4 hours upside down, and he is the very last person to be rescued from the Titanic. He should have been dead, but an explosion rockets it back up. He saves countless others. And then his story goes on to World War I, where he becomes a war hero there. He survived 4 shipwrecks in his life. His first was when he was 16 years old, marooned at sea for 6 days. And then this goes on until finally he has a conversation with a son who is serving in World War II, who explains to him about the Luftwaffe, the German airlines, and how to notice where their planes are coming down and getting ready to fire. His son tells him that, if you see the nose of a plane dip by 5 degrees, you'll know a plane's getting ready to fire and you can avoid that hit. Well, his son passes away. For the rest of his life, he has a debilitating fear of flying, but he has a yacht. And in 1940, Hitler invades France and the British forces are stuck on the beach. And from this knowledge that he had in the last conversation with his son, he gets his yacht that fits 21 men and is the first civilian to arrive at Dunkirk and manages to save 130 men. And nobody knows that story unless you have somehow specific interest in the Titanic. Nobody knows that story. And there's all these people in history that have these incredible stories. And that's where the term God's favorite came from. And I am, I have been telling you about Charles Littler, so let's go to the next slide. So I'm really, really excited. And I'm excited. I've been writing this. It's going to be 4 episode series on him, plus a 5th episode, which is a mini-sode about Violet Jessup, who is another woman who survived multiple shipwrecks. I can't tell if they were unlucky or lucky, but they seem to have really good luck because they kept surviving. They may have been jinxes, but the good news is with this TikTok account, and I hope you'll go check out my TikTok and wait for the podcast. It's, like I said, it's coming out September 1st this year. So never be afraid to use your other platforms to promote your content. And so that's really the end of my presentation. I think if you guys have questions for me, I'd love to talk about anything, any questions about the podcast or the creative process with that, I am available.
Yeah. And feel free to put your questions in the chat as well. I'm keeping an eye on that just so we can ask questions as we go along. Sarah says that she loves finding out about new podcasts and she's very excited to hear about yours. I am also I am also very excited to find out about your podcast because I am a big fan of History Chicks and a couple of other history podcasts that are really interesting because it makes the history actually come to life and it's not quite as simple as it seems. And I have seen some of your history talks, which are really, really funny.
It's been really strange. You're not really seeing a podcast that's already up and running. You're seeing the birth of a podcast from another medium. So, and writing the scripts and stuff, the research has been more daunting than I thought. I have piles of books by my bed. I have been going to sleep next to books about Charles Littler. And then the second series is going to be about the Marquis de Lafayette, since one of my friends actually referred to him as the Forrest Gump of history because he was quite literally at multiple major events from the American Revolution to the French Revolution to Napoleon, so he was there for a lot of it, right front and center. So it's a lot. The research is more daunting, even as a journalist. It's a lot of reading, it's a lot of writing, and it's a crazy process. But so that's, like I say, History Chicks and other podcasts are great. I've tried to avoid listening to any podcast that if I've seen one on a topic that I'm considering covering, obviously Napoleon notwithstanding there, because there's a bajillion podcasts about him, but Lightoller seems to be kind of untapped. There's a couple I have seen. One was a French podcast, so I didn't listen to that. But there's a couple of podcasts floating around out there. But I was amazed at how unknown his story was from the 50s on. It was very well chronicled in the book A Night to Remember. But that was in I think Night to Remember, the film came out in 1953, and he's a massive major center part of that. But that doesn't even go into the rest of his incredible life. So I'm excited to somehow be tapping into an unknown, not really an unknown, but an untalked about story.
Nice. So do you all have questions about podcasting or getting into podcasting, or even just favorite podcasts that you may want to share?
Yeah, share your podcast recommendations with me too. I'm always looking for more recommendations. I have too many as is now anyway, but if you're in history, check out those ones I had listed on here. Anybody else?
And I am still catching up. I heard Serial was good, but so
yeah, I like Serial.
With this in mind, how long do you think your episodes are going to go?
At this point, I'm clocking about an hour 15 for each episode. I've gotten, if I didn't feel like going and grabbing it out of my room, I have an entire whiteboard that has the complete breakdown of the Lightoller podcast. And I mean, just the outlining for the first episode. Actually, I will grab it. Just so you can kind of get an idea of, I don't know how well this is going to show up on here, but this is kind of what that looks like. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can make sure I'm seeing. But it's large. We have, obviously, I keep a picture of him on there just to remind me. Here's actually part of the first script. And then this is the entire episode 1. This isn't just multiple episodes. It's the entire first episode. So there's a lot of that going on with my planning process. I keep that up while I'm writing, just so I can talk about it. And I've got the first 4 episodes written. I'm going to be adding some supplemental elements to that, but it's going to take me about an hour 15, hour 30, I think, for each episode. The mini-sodes, we're hoping to clock in at about 20, 30, just as a, so there will always be a couple of episodes in a series, depending on how complex the topic is. And then it's bi-weekly, so every other week. And then the mini-sode will follow with a similar topic to the series, or a related topic, which is why we're doing Violet Jessup, who is another fascinating person. Wow. So yeah, and if you want to follow me on TikTok, if you have TikTok, my handle is at Melissa Fairlady. I should have a more history themed name, but that was my Fair Lady's my favorite movie, so that's usually my social media handle everywhere. And at this point, I'm just keeping it. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on that app. I'm pretty communicative. I'm on it all the time, much to my work's chagrin. So, but yeah, it's good stuff.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us today. I know you're got a lot going on with helping to keep the news afloat, but it is really fun to learn what goes on behind the scenes, or behind the curtain, so to speak, with the podcast and how that works. And I really appreciate you joining us today and giving of your time to share about your upcoming podcast. Do check out God's Favorites when it comes out, and keep track of Melissa on TikTok.
And we'll be talking about when that comes up. Yeah, we'll keep you posted on the release date.
I will post on our life page as well about when the release date is, and give a link to the podcast so that people can access it there when they want to. And next week, we are having with us librarian Dory Scott, who is going to be discussing how to prevent identity theft. So do join us for Life at Noon next week, and I will see you all then. Thank you so much.
See you guys. Thank you guys for coming.